Parshas Mattos-Masei. This week we read a double portion, the Parsha of Mattos and Masei. The beginning of Masei, that's Perek Lamed Gimel, Pasuk Aleph, that's 33:1, sets out what the Parsha is going to talk about, or at least the beginning of the Parsha, which is Ela Masei B'nei Israel. These are the travels of the children of Israel, Asher Yatzu Meretz Mitzrayim Litzivosam, who left Egypt according to their legions, Biad Moshe v'Aaron, at the hand of Moses and Aaron. Now then the next verse says that Moshe wrote down their journeys. The next verse, that's Gimel, verse 3, begins the trek. We're going to skip verse 4 for a minute and then come back to it. This is verse 3. Vayisu me Ramses, they left Ramses, B'chodesh Harishon, the first month, which according to the Torah is Nisan, B'chamishoso Yom L'chodesh Harishon, on the 15th day of the first month, 15th of Nisan, Mimachras HaPesach, the day after the Pesach offering. In other words, they brought the Korban Pesach, the Pesach offering at night, and then the next day they left. And it says, Yatzu b'nei Yisrael biad Ramah, the children of Israel left with an upheld hand, le'enei kol Mitzrayim, in the eyes of, or to the eyes of, meaning in the vision of, all of Egypt. In other words, all of Egypt saw them leave. Yad Ramah implies a certain defiance. So they left in defiance. We're out of here. Now we're skipping Pasuk Daled, that's the fourth verse, and we're going to continue. In other words, they left Egypt, they went from Ramses, and then it says, Pasuk Hey, that's 5, says, Vayisu b'nei Yisrael Ramses, v'yachanu b'Sukkos, left Ramses, they camped in Sukkos. Next verse, Vayisu b'Sukkos v'yachanu b'Esam, Shevik Seyam Midbar, they departed Sukkos, and they camped in Esam, and the next verse is, Vayisu b'Esam v'yoshav al pi'achiros, asher al pnei Batzfon, they left Esam, they arrived at Piachiros, Vayachanu, and they camped with name Migdol, Vayisu mi Piachra. So we see this is verse after verse, Vayisu Vayachnu, Vayisu Vayachnu, Vayisu Vayachnu. They traveled and then they encamped. They traveled and then they encamped. Goes on for 39, more than about 36, 37 verses. Okay, Vayisu Vayachnu. Now let's go back to the verse that we skipped, which is Daled. Right after we say they left with this Yad Ramah, with this defiant hand, upheld hand, then the verse says, Umitzrayim mikabrim es asher yikar Hashem bohem kol b'chor. Egypt was burying all those who Hashem had smitten, every firstborn, every b'chor. That's Makas B'choros, plague of the firstborn. It's the last of the 10 plagues. Uvelo hehem also Hashem shvatim, and their gods, God, Hashem, exercised judgment. What's that doing here? We start Vayisu Vayachnu, Vayisu Vayachnu. And here we have Mitzrayim Mikabrim. The Egyptians are burying. What does that have to do with anything? And we can ask another question, which is, how is it that the Bnei Yisrael left defiantly in the vision of, in the plain sight of the Egyptians? Why didn't they stop them? Well, you could say that the children of Israel were overpowering, but it doesn't say that. It doesn't say that they fought their way out. It does say they had an outstretched hand. But exactly how did this happen? And what did the Egyptians just stand on the side and watch them? Well, Rashi, on this verse on Daled, which puzzled us, which is, why are we interrupting to say that the Egyptians are burying their dead? Well, that may be why the Egyptians didn't stop them, but then is that really le'enei? Is that to the eyes of le'enei kol Mitzrayim? If they're in the Beis HaKvaros, if they're in the cemeteries all burying their dead and they can't pay attention, how is that le'enei kol Mitzrayim? This harkens back to Parshas Shlach, where the spies said they came to the conclusion that Israel, the land of Israel, the land of Canaan, was an Eretz Ocheles Yoshveha, was a land that consumed its people. And the Chazal say that what was happening when the spies scouted the land is that Hashem caused there to be many funerals, so that the people of the land would be distracted and not even see the scouts. So if people are distracted by burying their dead and they don't see what's around them, then how could it be that in verse 3 in Pasuk Gimel it says that they went out le'enei kol Mitzrayim, and yet the next verse says Mitzrayim mikabrim? The Egyptians are burying, in which case it's not le'enei kol Mitzrayim. It's not in the plain sight of the Egyptians. The Egyptians were distracted. So Rashi does not ask this question, but his formulation, we pick up on a curious aspect of his formulation to answer this question. Rashi comments on Umitzrayim Mikabrim, the Egyptians were burying. Rashi says two words, Terudim be'evlam. They were troubled in their mourning. So why is Rashi saying that? We know that burying the dead means burying the dead. So why does Rashi say Terudim be'evlam? That when it says that they were burying their dead, what it really means is that the Egyptians were preoccupied with their mourning. So the commentaries observe that in fact this answers the question. Mikabrim is different than kovrim. Kovrim says is a straight up they're burying. Mikabrim implies continuous action, and the continuous action, I mean, once you're done burying, you're done burying. But what Rashi says is no. Rashi says that the whole event was traumatic, the death of the firstborn and the burial of the firstborn. They were in shock. The Egyptians were terudim, they were preoccupied, they were troubled. As a result of being troubled, even though they were done with the burial, but the effect of the burial continued to the point that the Egyptians were so preoccupied by the overwhelming punishment and the death of the Bechorim, of the firstborn, that they couldn't respond. It's not that they didn't see. It's unlike, according to Chazal, it's unlike Parshas Shlach, where the inhabitants of the land of Canaan did not even notice the scouts. Here, it's le'enei kol Mitzrayim. They noticed, but they were so preoccupied with their own troubles that they simply didn't have the wherewithal to do anything about it. And that's why the Bnei Israel could go out, biyad Ramah, with an outstretched hand, and le'enei kol Mitzrayim, to the eyes of all of the Egyptians, and they didn't meet any opposition. It was only afterwards, after they left, that Prero gathered his forces to go out and to attempt to block the children of Israel from leaving. In fact, there's halacha that you're not supposed to wish an avel, a greeting. You're not supposed to be shalom b'shlomo. And one of the reasons it says is that he's told be'evlo, he's preoccupied. A person who's in mourning is preoccupied with the trauma of the death, the memory of the loved one who has passed, etc. And my late brother, Aaron Prero, suggested, Aaron Yosef, that this actually teaches us what the greeting of Shabbat Shalom is. That you don't greet a mourner with Shabbat Shalom because it's not possible for him to have Shalom. Why? Because that Shalom, that peace, is all over here. And an Avel, person who's mourning, can't escape being preoccupied and thinking about the one who passed. But somebody who doesn't have such a pressing concern, such as the death of an immediate close relative. So when you say Shabbat Shalom, what are you saying? What you're wishing a person when you say Shabbat Shalom is that he not be troubled, that on Shabbat, that on Shabbos, he has an open mind, a mind that's available for spiritual endeavors, for the study of Torah, for communicating with family, for prayer, etc. All of these things are difficult to do when one is preoccupied. And we know that on Shabbos, for example, one is not supposed to talk about business. One is supposed to try to keep the mundane obligations and happenings and ups and downs of the weekday out of the picture. We're supposed to put them out of our minds. And my brother suggested that this is the import of the greeting, of the blessing of Shabbat Shalom. It's a wish to give chizuk, to give encouragement to people, to control their thoughts, and to block out everything except that which one is supposed to be focusing on Shabbos. With an avel, that's a futile aspiration, because an avel is always preoccupied. This coming Shabbos begins the month of Av, is Rosh Chodesh Av, and that begins a more intense period of mourning for the temple. We are preoccupied with our loss, and we specifically attempt to be preoccupied. We don't distract ourselves with music or with parties and celebrations. There is an element of geula, of redemption, that's baked into the day, and it's called a moed. And we don't say Avinu Malkeinu. There are certain things that we don't do because we know that the switch will be flipped at a point in time, hopefully very soon, where the day of Tisha B'Av will no longer be one where we are downtrodden and preoccupied with our loss, but rather we will celebrate Mashiach, we will celebrate our redemption, we'll celebrate the rebuilding of the Beis HaMikdash, and our renewed relationship with the Almighty, with minds that are dedicated to God, not to our troubles, and to the simcha, to the rejoicing of redemption. Have a good Shabbos.